Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listener. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's episode, we invite you to leave behind your safe reality and descend with us into the frightening depths of the most terrifying imaginations, with 2 audio adaptations of chilling fiction about eerie creatures and unsettling human choices. I'm your host, Geoff Sturtevant, and tonight, and every Wednesday night, I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome our guest narrator, Brett Schumacher. Brett is the mastermind behind the Creepy Ghost Stories YouTube channel, where he crafts original horror content for his large and dedicated audience. Brett, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell our audience a little about yourself?
Thanks, Jeff. It's an honor to be here. As you mentioned, I'm the narrator behind Creepy Ghost Stories. I specialize in telling original creepy creature-related horror tales, some of which I've written myself. Outside of storytelling, I'm an executive chef, a pack leader to my 2 amazing dogs, and someone with a passion for psychological horror and sometimes marine biology.
That's fascinating. It's clear you bring a wealth of passion and creativity to your work. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight. Without further ado, let's dive into our first offering of the night. Our first tale this evening is written and narrated by none other than tonight's guest, Brett Schumacher. In this chilling narrative, a man's retreat to his childhood cabin in the Appalachians takes a terrifying turn when he encounters a creature unlike anything he's ever seen. So without further ado, here's Brett with "A Strange Creature Hunted Me Near My Cabin in the Appalachians."
Ever since I was a child, the Appalachian Mountains have been my escape. My family owned a small cabin in Irwin. It was nestled in the foothills, a rustic retreat we would visit every summer to get away from the bustling life in Nashville. Those summers were a world apart, a time when I could breathe freely and let my imagination run wild. The cabin was simple, with no electricity or modern conveniences, but it was perfect. The fresh smell of pines and honeysuckle still brings a smile and a sense of peace like nothing else. The smell of honeysuckle in the air used to be how I knew we were getting close to the cabin. And I remember sitting in the back seat of the Chevy, window rolled down, warm, sweet air rushing over me as Dad drummed his thumbs on the steering wheel, keeping time, and Mom sang along to Bob Seger. It was Dad's favorite music when he was driving on those long trips. Turn the Page was always the first song he played as we pulled onto the open road and headed for the cabin. And Like a Rock was always what he played as we drove up the rutted dirt road and right into the yard of our little summer getaway. I spent countless hours every day exploring hidden trails, discovering secret groves and marveling at the breathtaking vistas that stretched out before me. I was running through a labyrinth towards a castle ruin to save the village from some fictional monster hiding there. And that lasted until I was about 9. And that was the summer I imagined I was sneaking through the enchanted forest, full of vile and deadly creatures to save the damsel in distress. Granted, I didn't know what to do with her once I saved her because, in my imagination, the whole village had been decimated and her parents were gone. As I got older, I felt like a wary soul, a monk wandering and ever looking inward by looking outward at the beauty of nature. Whatever phase I was going through, the dense forests, the winding trails, and the sheer solitude always called to me, offering a refuge from the chaos of city life. The mountains became part of me, a place where I truly felt at home and at peace. The years passed. I grew up, went away to college, earned a degree in psychology, which turned out to be completely useless, and went to work at an advertising agency. Now, you think your job is boring? I don't even get a chance to break an honest sweat, unless you call sweating because the AC went on the fritz. Surrounded by cubicles and the overheard bits and pieces of 100 different conversations, the constant clacking and rattling of keyboards while I sit in a 6x6 office, I go a little bit insane. I'm supposed to be creative at my job, caring and attentive to the clients and their ever-changing whims, and still live some semblance of a normal life after clocking out at 5 in the evening. Now tell me, how are you supposed to do anything but turn into the most boring person in the world in an environment like that? Creativity doesn't bloom under the harsh fluorescence of an office. It dies a little more every time you try to hold it in the confines of the cubicle. And it'll flip you off and walk away forever when you try to force it to the foreground for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Sorry. You see, true creativity doesn't give a crap about time clocks, your quota, or anything else. Creativity is simple. It lives hand in hand with imagination. Now, my wife, Judy, she got fed up with the rut I was in back in 2019. Long story short, I caught her with one of her coworkers in my bed. Her defense was that I was boring. We were too young to be moping around the house when I was off to work, like a couple of old retired people. She said I was in a rut and needed to drag myself out of it if I ever wanted our relationship to work again. After all that, she acted shocked that I didn't want to save the relationship. Go figure. So she threatened to take the house, the quarter-acre lot behind it that I bought outright 7 years ago, and the 2017 Acura I'd only bought because she hounded me over it so badly. I laughed. I packed 2 bags, tossed her the house key and the Acura keys, and went out the door. And that's the last I saw of her. Not that I'm complaining, mind you. It's better to walk away than to become somebody you're not. And I was really close to becoming a very bad person the day I walked in and caught him and her together. I know, it's a sad luck story like so many people have, but it's also my story. And sitting propped up in this permanent hospital bed, only able to move my upper body a little, and without the hope of ever walking again, my stories are all I've got. What's that? Oh, how did I end up being paralyzed from the waist down, you might ask? Well, let me tell you the story behind that. The last time I went to the cabin, I needed the mountains more than ever. I'd just gone through that painful breakup I was telling you about. The city was suffocating me with its relentless noise and memories that I wanted to forget. The constant reminders of that ruined relationship, coupled with the pressures of daily life and the work days that stifled my very soul, had me feeling overwhelmed and trapped. Everywhere I turned, there were echoes of my past with her. Our favorite coffee shop, the park where we used to walk, the apartment we had shared when we were first married. The weight of it all was becoming unbearable, and I knew I needed to get away, to find some space to heal and to breathe. I decided to take a week off of work and go to the cabin. It was mine. She would never get that. Not that she would want to. I mean, she hated the cabin, the woods, and just nature in general, I think. But I hadn't been there in a couple of years, and the trip was the only thing I had been genuinely excited for in a long time. The cabin stood nestled among the trees, a quaint and charming relic of the past. Not just any past, but my past. I had forgotten how great the place really was. It was constructed of rough-hewn logs and had wooden shingles. Moss had taken hold and covered some of the shingles along the back closest to the trees. The sturdy stone chimney rose from one side of the cabin. The whole thing had been weathered by its decades of exposure to the harsh mountain elements. I didn't see my parents one time for over a year, and when I finally did get back home to visit them, I was shocked at how much they had aged in that short period of time. It was like that with the cabin. It had only been 2 years, but the place seemed to have aged at an accelerated rate during that time. The same 2 handmade rocking chairs sat on the small front porch along with the matching bench. I smiled and went to the bench to trace my name where I had carved it when I was a kid. Did that with the first pocket knife my dad ever gave me. It was also right after Mom had brought that furniture from a guy in town. She was so mad at me that day. I felt horrible. Dad saw how bad it affected me, and in an attempt to make me feel better, he carved his and Mom's initials on the other end of the bench, finishing it off by carving a big crooked heart around his work. Mom's anger didn't last long after that, and we were back to being happy and carefree again. It's funny what brings on bouts of nostalgia, and I knew the cabin would be loaded with those triggers. I didn't mind. It would be a good way to unwind in the evenings when I finished playing in the mountains. Or should I say the grown-up thing and say after I finished hiking in the mountains, but we all know the truth, so it doesn't matter, does it? I opened the door and stale air tinged with a pungent smell of cedar and old dry pine hit me. The fireplace still held the 2 logs I'd placed there the last time my wife and I had visited. I'd planned this whole romantic evening, but it never happened. In the kitchen, the little cast iron stove sat in the corner, patiently waiting for the next meal I would cook on it. The sinks had cobwebs and a fine sheet of dust coated everything in the house. Otherwise, everything was in order. That first whole day I cleaned and got settled in. The place wasn't as dirty as I had feared it would be, but it was bad enough. The second day I packed my gear and walked to my favorite trailhead in the Appalachians. The journey there felt like a pilgrimage, each step bringing me closer to the sanctuary I so desperately sought. As I walked, the familiar sights in the mountains filled me with a sense of anticipation and relief. The mountains had never let me down before, and I was certain that a few days of hiking alone would clear my mind and help me find some peace. The air was crisp and cool as I began my ascent, the strong smell of pine and earth grounding me with each step. The familiar crunch of last fall's leaves underfoot was a welcome reminder of why I loved this place, and I could feel the tension in my body starting to ease. As I ascended further into the mountains, the tranquility began to work its magic on me. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the gentle babbling of distant streams created a soothing symphony that washed away the noise of the city. I felt a sense of liberation, as if the weight of my troubles was being lifted. The first day, I set up camp not too far from the cabin. I wanted to get my bearings after being away for so long. The clearing was a familiar place, flat, grassy, and surrounded by short, fat maples that gave plenty of shade. I used to go there when I was a kid to play. I dug a fire pit when I was 12, and I lined it with stones from the stream that was only 100 feet away. The pit was still there, as were the stones. I had buried an Altoid tin with money in it. It was only a couple of dollar bills and some change, but I felt like a pirate burying a treasure. After pitching the tent, I looked toward the little mound of rocks by one of the trees. Most people would see it and think someone had buried a pet there. But I knew the red and white tin with pirate treasure was there. I moved the rocks and dug about 6 inches into the dirt, and the tin was there. I took it out and opened the lid. 2 crumbled dollar bills, 10 dimes, 2 nickels, and 2 quarters. $3.60. Thinking of how excited I had been when I put that money in there, I laughed and buried it again. I couldn't help thinking that if my ex had just come with me, we could have been sharing that moment together, bonding. I would have told her some of the stories from when I was a kid playing in the mountains, and she, in turn, would have shared some of her happy childhood memories growing up in the city. But no, that was only a fantasy world. In the real world, we wouldn't have made it to the cabin before we were arguing, and it probably would have been over something so insignificant that neither of us would remember it the next week. Anyway, that night, the soothing sounds of owls hooting farther up the mountain and the gentle, constant rippling of the stream soothed me to sleep in a matter of minutes. It was the easiest I had fallen asleep in years. When I woke, the first thing on my mind was my ex, Judy. I mean, why wouldn't she just leave my mind? Leave me alone out there in my peaceful solitude. I hoped that she preyed on her new man's mind and gnawed on his soul just like she had did mine. Her vitriol, her spite, and her deceit were like poison running through me. Before breakfast was cooking on the fire that morning, my mind had replayed at least a dozen of our most recent arguments. I hiked the rest of the day like I was running away from something horrible and scary. Maybe I was trying to run away from a life that had hampered and smothered me for far too long. And maybe I was trying to outrun my and Judy's voices echoing down throughout the years, arguing and threatening, saying vile things to each other, tearing our love down one piece at a time. I worried that the whole hiking adventure would be like that, and I made several concentrated and very conscious efforts to put my mind on a different, happier path. But it refused to stay there for long. By the 3rd day, I had settled into a rhythm, my mind beginning to clear. I was no longer consumed by thoughts of my ex. Instead, I found myself marveling at the beauty around me. The dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, the vibrant colors of wildflowers dotting the trail, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife reminded me of why I had always loved this place. That afternoon, I noticed a movement a distance away on the trail. At first, I thought it was just another deer, a common sight in those parts. But as I drew closer, something felt off. The creature's movements were jerky and unnatural, and its eyes seemed far too intelligent or intent. I don't know which I thought at that exact moment. I just knew the thing wasn't normal. I had heard about the zombie deer disease and wondered if that was what I was seeing. Maybe in its early stages, but it worried me to think that there was one deer in such close proximity that might be diseased. He had 4 points and those antlers looked deadly to me, especially with the way he was tossing his head, snorting, and eyeing me with what seemed to be hate. I don't even know if animals do hate. I mean, do they even have the capacity for that feeling? I don't know, but that's definitely what I felt when we made eye contact. Those eyes seemed human, though. Knowing and clever, and the face was misshapen somehow. It's hard to describe, and because the sun was coming in through the trees on my left, casting long slanted shadows across the animal, I could only think it was a trick of the light and shadow because it seemed to have human-like features. I froze, unsure of what to do. It was incredibly difficult to look into its eyes. It felt as if I was doing something very wrong every time I did, but I couldn't just drop my gaze and not look at it. If it charged, could I outrun it? If it came at me, there was no way I'd have time to get the rifle from my back and get a shot in. My brain raced with different scenarios and possible escape routes. Then the deer bolted to my right and down into a deep ravine. I ran to the edge and watched as he disappeared into the thickets. Now I tried to rationalize what I had seen and what I was still seeing, but I couldn't. The deer's legs weren't right. They were muscular, and their movements were erratic, almost like a video glitching. The not deer. The thought burst into my mind, and for a moment, I was filled with an unimaginable dread and fear. Trying to shake off the fear, I turned away from the edge of the ravine. The deer or the creature was gone from sight. I forced a laugh, and the suddenness and loudness of the sound made me jump. I hadn't realized that all the noise had stopped except for the sound of the small, distant stream. There was no birds flying and chirping, no small animals chittering and rustling through the underbrush. Even the wind was still. It seemed like a good time to call the days-long hiking trip done and over with. If I hiked like I meant it, I could be back to the cabin in about 15 or 20 hours. Now that seemed like a very long time to be out there, but I would have to stop at night. See, I wasn't happy about it, but I knew it was necessary. No need acting like a scared jackrabbit and getting hurt. If you get hurt, you'll be really vulnerable to whatever the creature does to people like you, to intruders. You see, that thought came unbidden, and it caused the sickly cold sweat to cover me. No one even knew if that creature was real or not. My parents had enjoyed telling stories about it, but by the time I was a teenager, I thought it was just a tale to keep me closer to home when I went out into the woods alone. Made sense then. Still does now. You want to give your teenager freedom enough to roam and feel independent, but you don't want to give them enough freedom that they get too far out of range in case something bad does happen. You know what I mean. But I had seen that thing. Nah, it was just a damn deer, I said out loud as I hurried in the opposite direction. It must have been the light and shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But no matter how much I rationalized it, my feet didn't slow down. I didn't even stop to eat or rest or to take in the beauty as I had done on my way up the mountain. 3 days was enough of soaking in the tranquility and beauty of nature for me. Chill ran throughout me as I realized this was no ordinary deer. The creature turned its head towards me, and I froze in my tracks. its face almost human-like, with an unsettling, knowing gaze. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after days of solitude. But the eerie feeling gnawed at me, and I just couldn't shake it off. I decided to continue on my path, hoping that the creature would lose interest and disappear into the forest. But as I set up camp for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. As the darkness enveloped the forest, I heard rustling outside my tent, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered out. And there it was, the creature, its eyes glowing unnaturally in the moonlight. It stood on its hind legs, mimicking human posture, and let out a low, guttural sound that sent shivers throughout me again. After a brief moment, it disappeared into the woods. Panic set in as I realized that this creature definitely was not of this world. I grabbed my gear and started to hike throughout the night, hoping to put as much distance between us as possible. If I got hurt, well, I pushed that worry out of my mind. If I had stayed at the campsite, huddled in my tent, trembling in my boots, then I would probably end up dead for sure. Tent fabric wouldn't even slow something like that down if it decided to get at me. I left the tent, grabbed my pack and rifle, kicked dirt over the small remains of my fire, and hit the trail with my heart hammering. But no matter how fast I moved, the creature was always there, just behind me, its unsettling presence growing stronger. Every time I looked back, though, there was nothing but darkness. A darkness that was too massive for my flashlight to even slightly eradicate. But I saw no glowing eyes and heard no guttural growl or whatever that noise had been. Exhausted and terrified, I finally reached the ledge of the forest at dawn, vowing to never return to those cursed mountains. My legs felt like rubber as I smiled and looked down at the top of the cabin. Safety, and more importantly, shelter from that nightmarish animal I had seen. Shelter that would stand sturdy if it had somehow tracked me and tried to get inside. I patted the side of the cabin as I turned the corner and stepped up on the little porch. The rough wood was a welcome sensation. It symbolized strength and resilience for whatever might come its way. I slept like the dead for the rest of the day and woke around 9:30 that night. I stretched and yawned and sat up on the edge of the bed facing the one little window in the loft. Recalling what had happened, another chill ran down my back, and for some reason, that feeling of complete dread encompassed me again. My hands involuntarily gripped the edge of the mattress on either side of me. Something was wrong, very wrong. And then I heard it, a footstep on the stairs. There was no other room upstairs, only mine, and there was no door at the top of those stairs either. Nothing between me and whoever was climbing the steps, one slow, deliberate step at a time. My cell phone was on the bed somewhere. I dropped it there before going to sleep. I forced myself to let go of the mattress and ran my hands lightly over the pillow, underneath it, and then under the covers. And just as I felt the weight of it on top of my hand, it rattled loudly to the floor on the other side of the bed, the side closest to the door. I froze, eyes glued to the doorway, breath locked in my throat. My rifle was propped against the fireplace downstairs. The cabin had been a safe haven my entire life. And now, in one terrible day, the woods in the cabin had been changed forever. The footsteps stopped, and for an awful moment, I thought the thing from the forest had somehow come into the house. My gut twisted and sweat slicked my back. Logically, I knew it wasn't that thing. It was someone. People do break into houses. And a ragged breath later, I was scrambling over the bed toward where the phone had landed. The footsteps came again, louder and faster. There were only 2 steps left for the intruder to climb when my hand closed around the phone. I flipped it over and dialed 911 and hit the call button in the span of 2 heartbeats. The intruder rushed through the doorway and hit me from the side as I tried to crawl over the bed again. As I tumbled toward the floor, I heard that unnatural guttural sound and knew I was in the kind of trouble that 911 couldn't get me out of. The operator came on and asked the location of my emergency. I couldn't make a sound other than drawing a tight, shaky breath as I realized the thing from the woods was standing on my bed and that it could probably see me clearly with those terrified, glowing eyes. At least more clearly than I could see it. It was a black silhouette moving in the darkness. The operator asked for the address again. 152 Mountain Branch Road. The creature shrieked and dropped towards me. I turned the phone screen around in time to see 2 muscular front legs pedaling and in a quick descent toward my face. I dropped the phone and flipped onto my side with my back toward the creature as I curled into a fetal position. The hooves hit my back, tearing the skin and ripping at the muscle. As the attack continued, I managed to get to my feet, bolting for the door. I thought there was a glimmer of hope. If I could get downstairs and outside, I could get to the car. But that creature rammed me into the wall and backed up to get me with the hooves again. I ducked, pushed from the wall, and went out the door, its hooves thudding against the wall, and the thing made that awful sound again. The stairs were narrow and steep. I made it to the 3rd step, and the creature hit me in the back with its full weight. The world tipped, flipped, and tumbled as we fell and rolled to the bottom, where I lay stunned and unable to get up. Struggling, I turned my head and saw the creature laying in a broken pile at the door. Its head was twisted all the way around, and the glow in its eyes was gone. Its tongue lolled out of the side of its misshapen mouth and rested on the floor. It was dead. Blood oozed from the side of my head into my ear, and I instinctively tilted my head and reached up to wipe it out. More blood, thick and heavy, ran down over my forehead, and the world jittered in front of my eyes. I felt like I was going to puke and pass out at the same time. I put my hand on my head to find the bleeding wound. My fingers slipped between a flap of skin and my skull. I remember cringing and thinking that somehow my head was on fire. And then there was nothing. When I woke up 3 days later in the hospital, I was nervous. I didn't know how long I'd been out, how I'd gotten there, or what had become of the carcass of the creature on my living room floor. When a nurse came in to check on my changing vital signs, she smiled and answered my initial questions with that same sweet smile. Then I asked her what happened, and she said that apparently I'd gone hunting and had become the hunted. And I asked her what she meant by that, and she said that I'd been deer hunting and I was attacked by a buck on my porch. I was lucky that I made it inside and called 911 before passing out. Or I might be dead. At least, I knew what they thought had happened. But that meant that that creature hadn't been there when the first responders arrived. The pretty nurse confirmed that the big mean deer had run back home into the woods by the time the EMTs got there. I couldn't even be mad at her condescending remark. I was too busy getting sick. Getting sick because that meant that the creature hadn't been dead, only stunned by the fall. That or I had the ability to heal a broken neck and 2 twisted legs. It was a demon. Why wouldn't it be able to survive a fall down some stairs? Well, hell, I started to laugh. I pushed my hands against the bed to sit up a little straighter. My leg didn't bend. I couldn't push my foot against the bed for traction. I tried 3 times while I was chuckling. But the laughter died when I saw the look of pity on the nurse's face. "What's wrong with my legs?" I asked. She held up a finger and stepped out of the room to hail the doctor. He informed me that during the tragic fall, I had sustained several injuries. The worst was the damage to my spine that would leave me paralyzed for the rest of my life. He offered condolences, and with them barely out of his mouth, he was telling me all of the great programs for paraplegics. I only heard the first few sentences and turned him off. I retreated inwards where I could relive the tragic accident, and only came around again when he chuckled in that way that only the very rich can accomplish. He proceeded to give me a light lecture about safety around wildlife, and finished by pointedly looking at my legs and taking a deep breath. "I'm not going to lecture you." He hugged his clipboard and pasted on a fake smile that made me want to punch him in the nose. "Well, it seems like the only thing I'll be hunting is a reason to live after this," I said angrily. And that was the beginning of a long many years of mental therapy for me. I've been out of it for a while now. I could do most everything for myself. And the things I can't do, I have a nurse who can. And instead of a marriage full of drama, a day job that I hate, a car that, hell, I could barely pay for, I have my stories. And in case you're wondering, yeah, even now, I could still see the creature's haunting eyes in my nightmares. And I know it's out there, stalking through the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to be unlucky enough to meet it.
Love horror stories? Well, I've got plenty to share. I'm Otis Gyrie, your host, for Otis Gyrie's Nightmare Fuel, where every week I spin spine-chilling tales that'll have you sleeping with the lights on. Picture this: a crackling campfire, the dark woods of Camp Duskwood, and Twilight Lake whispering in the distance. That's where I invite campers, just like you, to join me around the fire as I share stories of haunted highways, cursed deals, and things lurking just out of sight. If you're a fan of chilling tales for dark nights, you'll feel right at home by my fire. So pull up a seat. The stories are dark, fire's warm, and there's always room for one more camper. Just don't wander too far into the woods. You never know what's watching. Otis Gyrie's Nightmare Fuel has just debuted, and I've got spine-tingling episodes waiting for you to binge right now. New campers, join me every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for fresh tales of terror. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find quality podcasts. Join the campfire, if you dare.
That was A Strange Creature Hunted Me Near My Cabin in the Appalachians, written and performed by Brett Schumacher. Brett, that was a gripping tale. I think our audience is going to want to hear a lot more from you. Where else can they find your work?
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the kind words. You can always find me on my YouTube channel, Creepy Ghost Stories, but there's plenty more to explore. For readers who enjoy diving deeper into the dark, you could check out my author page on Amazon. Horror has always been a passion of mine, with a particular love for stories about isolation and cryptids. I have a few books out right now. My most popular one is Leash and Other Short Horror Stories. It's an anthology of 13 creepy, scary, and sometimes gruesome monster tales.
I've seen the description for Leash, and it's chilling. The collection features stories that take readers into the unexpected. Tales of deceit, unspeakable beings, and terrifying encounters. You'll find a gas station attendant stalked by a creature during a violent storm, a horrifying journal from the swamps of Louisiana, camping trips gone horribly wrong, and even a butcher's child made of steel and blades. And that's just the beginning.
Exactly, it's a mix of hair-raising, paranoia-inducing tales that are sure to stick with you.
Listeners, you can get Leash and Other Short Horror Stories for just $2.99 on Kindle or $12.99 in paperback. It's a must-read for fans of terrifying fiction.
And don't forget, you can also connect with me on Facebook, facebook.com/creepyghoststories1. That's the number 1 for updates and more. And if podcasts are more to your liking, then check out Creepy Ghost Stories, Tales from the Grave, on Spotify or wherever you listen to quality podcasts.
And here's one more exciting update for all of you. Tomorrow, on Thursday, December 5th, Brett will perform Chilling Tales for Dark Nights creator Craig Groshek's original story, They Feed at Night, on his channel, Creepy Ghost Stories. It's a gripping tale of a suburban family whose peaceful life is shattered when an eerie encounter with a clawed, glowing-eyed figure spirals into a nightmare of survival. As strange noises outside the window escalate to an invasion of their home by something beyond comprehension, the story weaves a terrifying descent into darkness. Brett, I know our audience won't want to miss that. If you stop by, don't forget to let Brett know that Geoff and the team of Chilling Tales for Dark Night sent you. It would mean a lot to us.
Sure, absolutely, Geoff. And They Feed at Night is an incredible story. I think it's one of Craig's best, in my opinion. And I had a great time narrating it. Be sure to find me on YouTube at Creepy Ghost Stories so you don't miss the premiere.
You heard him, listeners. And for our YouTube viewers, you'll find links to Brett's channel, Amazon page, Facebook, and podcast in the video description below. Be sure to check them out. Now, let's keep the chills coming and move on to our second story of the night, also written and performed by Brett. In The Perfect Cut, a group of teenagers find themselves in a horrifying situation after a simple act of mischief turns into a fight for survival. Brett, take it away.
Shit, he's still chasing us. I can't believe how much stamina this old guy has. Trevor burst out laughing as I watched over my shoulder. This Chinese dude easily looked to be in his 60s, but he had been running after us for more than 5 street corners. Normally, they would give up chase long before that. All of this running because we got the munchies and didn't have the money. It was only, 3 or 4 bags of chips and a couple of Monster Energy drinks? Had I known the guy would chase us like that, I would have chosen another corner store to shoplift. Not like there wasn't one in every corner in Brooklyn anyway. You're falling behind, Sam. Alex was right. I needed to up my running game if I didn't want that guy to catch up to us. We turned into an alleyway, threw our chips on the other side of the fence, and climbed it at the speed of light. The old geezer arrived a couple of minutes after, but only slammed his hands against the fence in frustration as we picked up our stolen goods, gave him the middle finger, and dashed away. We could still hear him curse in his native tongue as we slipped in the darkness of this alley and disappeared in the night. Mischief achieved. I slammed my fist against Trevor's shoulder and called him a dumbass. It was his idea to shoplift. I felt like my heart was about to burst out of my chest. Not only because of the running, but because that old guy was scary. I'm sure if he had caught up to us, he would have beaten the piss out of us. As we kept walking, I could feel my shirt sticking to my skin. Running made me sweat, and the breeze made me shiver. I couldn't go back home to change either, as I told my folks I was going to sleep at Alex's. We had planned to stay out for as long as we wanted. Alex's parents worked night shifts in a factory downtown, so we were basically on our own. No way we were going to stay in all night when we could stay out late and have a bit of fun. I did regret not bringing a jacket though. Nights in May are still fresh. Hey, let's break in. Trevor pointed at a street view window on what looked like a butcher's shop. I knew that place because my parents sometimes liked to buy steaks and sausage from that guy. I asked Trevor how he planned to get in exactly. I didn't mind the whole shoplifting chips and stuff, but breaking and entering was on a whole different level. Trevor's family was poor. Very poor, mind you. This kind of stuff he did on the daily. For as long as I knew the guy, he always was tangled in some mess. His mother participated in 1,001 internet jobs, and his dad was the kind of man who ran after get-rich-quick schemes. He also did prison time for scamming the folks at a retirement home in the countryside by selling fake life insurance. So, for him, breaking and entering wasn't a huge deal. To me, however, it was way above my petty theft and what my anxiety could handle. I didn't mind the occasional shoplifting, but I didn't have a mean bone in my body. Trevor called me a coward and walked toward a large green trash bin. There was an old broom handle in it. He quickly picked it up and walked back to us. As he proudly declared he wanted to test the alarm system, I checked around for cameras and I didn't see any. As soon as he slammed the broomstick and broke the window, my heart jumped in my chest and I started to feel guilty. I told my friends that we should go, that this didn't sit right with me. But since no alarms were sounding, Trevor cleaned up the glass around the window frame to make sure we would get in without getting cut. And then, without any further discussion or comments toward my willingness to proceed, he slipped into the broken window. Trevor called to us and told us it was warm in there. I looked back at Alex, who shrugged at me before following, as if saying it didn't matter anymore since what was done was done. I swallowed thickly, breathed deeply, gathered my nerves, and escaped my anxiety by reassuring that we would be okay as I made my way in. I wasn't going to be the only one who didn't dare enter. Even if it didn't sit right with me, I wasn't going to leave my friends alone. Trevor was right. It was warm inside. Warm and humid even. And it smelled exactly like you would think a butcher's basement smelled like. Blood, steel, and, well, something else that I didn't want to figure out what it was. The room we broke into looked like an office. There were exactly 2 chairs and a desk, and so we all chose a spot to sit and lit up a joint. And now that it was warm, there wasn't any wind, and an old Chinese man wasn't chasing after us, the conditions were stellar for smoking one. Plus, my anxiety could really use the downer that came with being high. Pot always made me feel at peace. We took a few drags and opened our chips, exchanging the joint with Doritos' cheese-stained fingers. I don't remember what we were joking about, but I know Trevor laughed so hard he nearly fell off the desk. And then we heard it. It was like a scream, but it sounded metallic, or, if you will, a scream trapped in a tin can, and then hit with reverb and auto-tune blasted out to huge-ass speakers. It echoed throughout the whole building and the office we were in. My blood turned to ice, and I dropped my can of Monster on the ground. We all heard it, and my friends were making the same face I was. The fuck was that? Trevor was the first to reply. My brain was screaming at me to get out of there. Even if the joint had calmed me down and made me forget about my initial anxiety, that metallic screeching woke it back up as it had never left. The three of us stood in silence, expecting the scream to come back, but it didn't. After 3 minutes of waiting with bated breath, Alex suggested that it might have been a machine. Maybe some screws were going loose and making the machine wince loudly. I felt creeped out, but it made sense. It could have been an old meat grinder or something. How could I know? I'm not an expert on butchers, tools, and machinery. We all laughed about it for approximately 5 seconds before another loud noise had us holding our breath in fear. It sounded like chains and blades being dragged on the ground. They didn't seem to move closer or further, so we could only assume whatever was making that noise was rooted in its spot. I felt my mouth go dry and picked up my monster can from the floor to take a sip at whatever hadn't spilled. My mind was hazy because of the joint, but I felt the telltale weight of anxiety crushing my chest. "We should go," I said, my voice not quite as loud and confident as I would have wished it was at the time. I sounded like a coward, and I knew it, but this feeling of trepidation creeping along the length of my spine didn't seem to let go. In fact, every fiber in my body was screaming at me to get out while I still could, even if another part of me was piqued with curiosity about what was making that noise. I, however, didn't want to be the one to suggest we go check it out. Fortunately, I didn't have to. Trevor was quick to tell me to knock it off, and that he wanted to know what it was. All we had to do was open the lock and look in the other room. If anything turned out bad, we could always make it out the same window. Alex didn't seem to have any qualms about whether we left or stayed, but he had always been more courageous than me. We decided to open the door and check. Just a glance, nothing more. Once we opened the door, we were disappointed we couldn't see anything. Of course, it was night, so all the lights had been turned off. Plus, it didn't seem like the next room was the one with whatever machine was making that dreadful noise. It looked like a hallway leading to different rooms, and a staircase that probably led up to the shop. This place still looked a lot bigger than we expected. The butcher's shop was relatively small, only a storefront with a few refrigerators. The basement looked about 13 times bigger. We walked down the hallway, opening all the doors that weren't locked on our way. On our left, most of the doors were locked. On our right, there was a locker room. We turned on the light and saw a few blood-stained aprons, work boots, and a bench in the middle. It almost looked like the locker room at our school, if only smaller and grimier. We turned off the lights and closed the door before continuing our exploration. Just as we were closing the door, we froze in our spots as that loud scream tore through the atmosphere again. It was so high-pitched and close, it couldn't be just a machine. I swore I could hear a voice, a real human voice, in that abominable screeching. My hair stood on end, and my fight-or-flight response was triggered. And if I were honest with myself, I would have chosen flight this instant if I had been alone. Trevor, on the other hand, seemed almost thrilled because we were getting closer. There was a corner at the end of the hallway, and once we turned it, we saw a pair of mean-looking double doors. They were framed with iron, and I hoped they were locked. It felt like I was holding my breath and having an out-of-body experience as I walked toward the doors. I could hear the echo of my footsteps against the concrete floor and my breathing. But every other noise seemed to have been silenced. Then, the sounds of a chain and metal dragging, making my hair stand on end. My curiosity was satiated at this point, and I wanted nothing more than to dash out of this place. I couldn't even enjoy my high anymore. I was so tense that my buzz had pretty much been beaten down by adrenaline. I was about to say we shouldn't go into those charnel doors. I was getting overwhelmed by my crippling anxiety, and my feet refused to move. "It's open." The two words I didn't want to hear at the moment. They resonated along the walls of the hallway and hit my eardrums with the intensity of speakers on max level. It made my heart skip a beat and my bones tremble. I swallowed thickly but stood in silence as both Alex and Trevor opened the iron doors. Again, the sounds of chains rattling and blades grinding on concrete reached me, rooting me on my spot. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to go. "There's nothing, see? We really should go," I said with a shaking voice. "Wait, what's this?" Trevor said. There was a tiny bit of light coming from a dirty street window. As Trevor's hands searched for the light switch on the wall, I tried to decipher what the hell I was seeing. It was a big lump of plastic and metal in the far corner of a huge room. There were also a few machines that looked like they had been left to gather dust. This room looked as though it served several purposes, such as storage for old, discarded machinery, and a meat-cutting section. I would also see the outline of another set of double doors, though these looked more airtight. A cold room, maybe. Back to the lump of plastic and metal. It was covered in metal plating and a knife was dangling slightly, and now I could hear the previously inaudible incessant dragging of chains. Now and then, the sound was more intense because the mess of plastic and steel moved faster as if struggling. I knew it didn't make sense. Machines don't move on their own. But what I was looking at didn't seem to be entirely mechanic either. "Found it," Trevor announced victoriously as he flipped the switch. Unfortunately for him, all he managed was to turn on a fan that made a thunderous noise over our head. I stared up at the ceiling as loud bangs came from the ventilation system, and I screamed at him to turn it off. The thing screamed almost at the same time as me, essentially shutting me up. We were on the other side of the room, but the sound was so clear now that I instinctively put my hands on my ears, trying to protect myself. I felt like this sound would pierce through my eardrums. Angry that his light switch wasn't one, Trevor abandoned his search and just decided to start walking across the room to get closer to the mess of plastic, metal, and chains. For a second, I admired his bravery. Then, I felt fear gnawing at my insides. We shouldn't have been there. I heard Trevor ask, "What the fuck was that?" and call us to him. My feet moved against my will in his direction. The closer I got, the more I could make out what I was seeing. But despite my eyes seeing more clearly, my brain didn't understand what I was looking at. I was looking at a hulking monstrosity of twisted plastic and grime-covered steel. I could see what looked like human flesh twisted in a tin can-looking enclosure, some parts swollen and darkened by necrosis. All I could think about was a fake internet news article, which stated, "Human flesh tasted like pork," as I walked closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and the closer I got, the more I understood what I had smelled earlier. It wasn't only blood and metal, it was death. I smelled putrefied flesh, pus, and infection. It smelled like something was rotting. I didn't notice it when he opened the door because all the machines were stained with dried blood, but the closer I got, the more intense the stench. I had to cover my nose when I was a few inches away. The thing was wrapped in chains, and there were very few large blades embedded in the creature. Between the plastic and grime-covered steel, there were enough holes for us to peek into the tin can and see what it contained. But what was inside? didn't look like anything anymore. It was swollen and pink like exposed bloodied flesh, or darkened and yellowish, oozing pus. And then I saw an eye. I saw an eye with a yellowish sclera and almost white irises looking at me from one of the holes. It saw me, and for some reason, I felt like I recognized that eye. Before I could jump out of my skin and run for my life, I had heard that scream again. It made me fall to my knees, holding my head with my hands. I felt something warm soaking my jeans, and when I looked down, I realized I'd knelt in a pool of half-coagulated blood and pus. It was at that point when I heard Alex scream, and I realized I wasn't the only one who noticed. The monstrosity stopped screaming, and I heard Alex gargle. When I looked up, I saw blood dripping from his mouth, and I jumped to my feet. It took me half a second to realize what had happened. I stood there in shock as my eyes followed the blood dripping from his chin and onto a thin, pale arm. The arm was covered in slashes, and there were a few layers of skin missing. It also looked like the muscle on his forearm had been sliced thin, and yet it was strong enough to hold this heavy-looking blade. It was strong enough to move forward and stab my friend through his abdomen. I wanted to move, I wanted to run, but I saw the blade twist and blood flowing out of my friend's shirt. I couldn't move. I could only stare in horror as Alex dry heaved and choked up blood, and the blade started slicing downward. I heard a disgusting squelching, splattering noise as his viscera left his body and fell to the ground. It was nothing like in the movies. They didn't fall cleanly out all at once. They slowly rolled out as if the scene was playing in slow motion. The abomination pulled its blade out, and Alex fell to the ground face first into his own gore. "Go!" Trevor yelled as he pushed me back into reality. We couldn't stay there. I heard another scream, this one shorter, more metallic, and then the telltale sound of chains and blades scratching the ground. I could also hear the disgusting noises of blood and organs being crushed by this thing's feet as it dashed after us. As we reached the grim iron double doors, we extended our arms to push them open, only to slam harshly into them. They were locked. The doors could be opened from the other side, but they couldn't be opened from the inside. Whoever was keeping that monstrous eldritch abomination of flesh and steel knew what they were doing. We'd been had. We didn't pull the brakes and slammed into the door like birds on a clean window. We were lucky we didn't break our fucking necks. Though being lucky was the overstatement of the century, considering what was chasing us. I picked myself up first and helped Trevor, but there wasn't much distance between us and the creature. We needed to find a way out. Fortunately for us, it was deadly but not fast. As I was screaming at Trevor, "What the fuck was that?" it flailed a chain at us and caught my wrist. I felt like my bone shattered in my hand and I howled in pain. I didn't have time to check if it was broken or not. We ran into another corner, hoping that the darkness would play to our advantage. Trevor and I hid behind two big machines that looked like meat grinders as that monstrous thing stopped running. I saw a flash of the eye in my mind again. Why did I feel like I knew that eye? It looked human, even with the wrong sclera color and discolored iris. I felt like I knew who was in that disgusting tin can. The thing inhaled deeply. It was so deep and loud that we had heard it. Trevor put a hand on his mouth to control his breathing, but it served no purpose. It didn't want to hear us. It wanted to smell us. The smell of sweat and despair was sticking to us, and if that thing were only used to the smell of metal and blood, it would soon find us. And it did. It dashed towards us again, and I ran toward Trevor, hoping to catch his arm and run in the opposite direction. I was a hair too late. I saw that elongated arm reaching to him before me. It grabbed Trevor by the hoodie and pulled him up. Despite looking so sickly thin and scarred, his arm had more strength than I had. It pulled Trevor up into the meat grinder. I expected it to use its blade again, and so I tried to pull Trevor by his foot to bring him to my side of the machine, but it was too late. I heard the sound of blood splashing on the ground as the steel monstrosity turned on the meat grinder. I heard Trevor helplessly screaming for me to help him as his arm was shoved into the blood-hungry machine. And I could hear the skin detach from bone and vessels and bones being crushed, despite the intensity of Trevor's screams. I tried to pull on his foot, but the abomination's grip on him was too strong. Half of Trevor's arm was gone by the time he passed out, but he woke up a second later as his elbow and the rest of his arm was pushed toward the machine. I heard him scream, cry, and I smelled piss and blood as his shoulder was sucked in. My eyes locked with the eye of the monstrosity again, and I finally realized who it was. I didn't stay. I couldn't watch as Trevor's skull and brain were turned into mincemeat, head cheese. I ran the length of the wall until I reached the double doors on the other side of the room. I was covered in my friend's blood and shocked by the realization that I knew who the abomination was. Through the double doors I had entered a refrigerated room. There were pigs' bodies on hooks, as well as many racks of questionable sliced meat on the sides. I was relieved to see the door could be locked from the inside, so I locked it. Then, I moved one of the racks to block the doors for added protection and to slow down the abomination. On the other side of the cold room was another set of double doors, but this one was locked. I could see through the small window another room that looked like the one I just came in, but cleaner. More hygienic and with actual machines made for grinding meat. It was like I was looking in another dimension, but the right one. I tried to open the doors to no avail. They were locked. I heard the creature slam its blades and chains against the double doors behind me, but I couldn't see him. There were no windows on the doors where I came from. I don't know what time it was, but despite its strength, it couldn't open the doors. I heard it slam, scream, and slash at the doors for hours on end, and I sat on the ground and hid behind a rack, covering my ears. I prayed for every minute that passed that someone would come and rescue me. I don't know how many hours passed, but by the time someone came, the blood on me had coagulated. My shirt stuck to my skin and I was freezing. It mustn't have been more than 40 degrees in that cold room, probably a little less. I was wearing nothing but jeans and a shirt, both of which were soaked in various fluids, mostly blood. I was brought to the nearest hospital and treated for hypothermia. I'd been in that freezer for 4 hours before someone found me. My clothes were taken and processed as evidence, and I was questioned relentlessly. The officers' tones were accusatory. I couldn't blame them. I was a kid who shoplifted and broke into a building at night. I wish they'd cut me some slack after I went through. Plus, I told them everything they wanted to know, down to who the steel abomination was. It was Timmy, a friend I used to have a few years ago. When he disappeared, his parents left town and never came back. And I was 100% certain it was him. I saw the officers talking with my parents through the large window of my hospital room. They had me cuffed to the bed, but I could move enough to turn and look at them. I saw my mother's horrified gaze as she looked at me. I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but a few minutes later, the officers came back into the room. The older of the two looked at me harshly as the other younger officer gave me a look that made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. It looked like pity. Were they finally going to act like I was a victim? Don't worry, everything's going to be fine, the younger officer said, but I could see the older officer's upper lip twitch. What the hell was going on? I thought. My mother left the hallway, and I saw my dad looking at me through the window. I felt like I was leaving my body. He looked so hurt. Your parents will contact a lawyer, the older officer sneered. My head was spinning and a wave of nausea hit me. The door opened and I heard my mother talk to my dad. I couldn't catch everything, but I understood. About my coping mechanism, therapy I did as a child, and how all of this had been buried. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine, Sam. I looked up at the younger officer. My eyes glossed over. I couldn't handle the stress. But I didn't kill my friends. It was Timmy. I screamed between sobs of salty tears. You have to go back. You have to find the machine. The young cop leaned in close to my face. Son, there was no one in the butcher's shop. The butcher himself called us after his alarms went off. Nice man he is too, as he's not going to press charges against you for breaking and entering. That kid Timmy you're so up in arms about? Well, they found that kid dead a year after he went missing. The officers left the room, and I was left to my fate. The butcher was smart, and the butcher was wise. He hid Timmy in a clever disguise. A dark closet in a dank apartment cloaked a machine so grim that the FBI and the cops could never find him.
That was The Perfect Cut, written and performed once again by tonight's special guest, Brett Schumacher. Brett, what an unforgettable night of horror. Before we wrap up, let's remind everyone where they can find more of your incredible work.
Of course, Geoff. Listeners, if you're looking for a spine-chilling escape into a world of horror, look no further than my channel, Creepy Ghost Stories. From the eerie depths of Mantis Cave to the haunting truth of the sealed building, I've got plenty to keep you on the edge of your seat. Imagine yourself exploring the house on Harborview Road or facing an unspeakable terror in Stag Creek. What would you do if you encountered something mimicking your friends while working the night shift as a park ranger? Or if you boarded an empty ship only to realize that your crew is starting to change?
Well, you'll just have to tune in to find out. Brett's channel isn't just a collection of scary stories. It's an immersive journey into the unknown. And there's plenty to enjoy there. And don't forget his podcast, Creepy Ghost Stories, Tales from the Grave. Or to connect with him on Facebook at facebook.com/creepyghoststories1 to join the conversation. Again, listeners, if you check out any of Brett's content, do us both a favor. Like and subscribe, follow, and be sure to tell him that the spooky crew at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights sent you. Your support really makes a difference. And don't miss Brett Schumacher's chilling rendition of our creator Craig Groshek's tale, They Feed at Night, debuting tomorrow on his channel.
Absolutely. Don't miss it. I'd love to see you all there. And thanks again for having me, Geoff. It's really been a pleasure.
The pleasure's been ours, Brett. I'm Geoff Sturtevant, and it's been my pleasure to guide you through tonight's terrifying tales. Don't forget, we'll be welcoming a new guest narrator each Wednesday, so stay tuned for next week's surprise guest, where they and we will once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Until next time.
Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Tales for Dark Nights.